Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
There's one rule at the Stoa is when the song starts getting really good, we gotta start. So welcome to the Stoa, everyone. My name is Peter Weinberg, the steward of the Stoa. And the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And I see a few new faces here. If you don't know what the Stoa is, neither do I. It's an emerging mystery. Some call it a digital campfire, some call it a communal podcast. And those really cool post-rational meta-modern kids are calling it a meta-sangha, which I don't know what it means, but maybe we'll find out one day. So if our guest is not too scared by any of that, I will introduce him now. We're very lucky to have Justin Weinberg with us. Justin is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina. And he also runs a popular philosophy news discussion site called the Daily News. And I absolutely love this site. This is probably the best. Like I used to be an academic philosophy or back in university days, and I'm not plugged in that scene, but this is the site that I follow to kind of get up to date with that world. So I highly recommend it. And the topic today is going to be disagreeing well. I reached out to Justin, wanted to get him on for a while, and he proposed this topic, which is quite fitting for the Stoa, because we were talking a lot about reasoning well, disagreeing well. I'm going to be launching a Platonic Fight Club here soon. I've been sitting on this like innovative debate modality, psychotech, for a while, so I'm quite excited. So I'm really happy to pick Justin's brain on this. So how's it's going to work? Justin's going to talk for a bit. We're going to have a few back and forth. And if you have any questions, put your questions in the chat box. I will call on you, unmute yourself, ask your question, suggestion. If you don't want this to be on YouTube, because this will be on YouTube, or don't want you to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, I think I mentioned everything. Justin, how's it going today?
It's going pretty well. Thanks very much for having me, Peter. It's nice to be here. It's a new experience for me. And hello to everyone who tuned in. I thought I'd just start by saying a few words about my general orientation towards disagreement, because it informs my suggestions for how we move forward as a society in thinking about disagreement. So I start off with a kind of unconventional view that when we're trying to think about what the human good is, when we think about things that typically are candidates for the human good, we talk about things like happiness, we might talk about things like knowledge, we might talk about things like beauty. I think that up there in that category of things up there is conflict, or something like conflict. There's some good reasons to think that's the case. I'm not going to go into all the details about that. But we do seem to get something quite valuable out of conflict. We tend to enjoy conflict, and we learn from it. However, right, conflict isn't the only thing, of course, that's of value. There are lots of other things that might be of value. And in trying to figure out what kinds of conflict we might want to engage in, we have to assess which forms of conflict are compatible with the pursuit of other kinds of things we value, right? So, we value conflict, we also value relaxation sometimes, and pleasure, and time with friends, and music, and all of that, right? And so some forms of conflict are completely incompatible with the pursuit of those other goods. Nuclear war, for example, is a form of conflict. It's not a particularly great form of conflict because it's incompatible with most of the other things that we value. Watching a video of two other people playing a video game is also in some ways partaking in some kind of experience with a conflict, but it's two other people playing a video game. It's fairly trivial. It's not all that significant for most of us, watching two other people play a video game. What we need is a form of conflict that's compatible with the other things we care about, but something that gives us what we need out of conflict. It has to be important, it has to be meaningful. And so I think that a certain range of conflicts that we typically call moral disagreement or political disagreement hit that sweet spot. That is, they provide us with the good things that we need out of conflict, but are also quite compatible with most of the other things that we value in life. And so we should think of moral, conflict is part of the human good, and moral disagreement, political disagreement as especially excellent forms of conflict, which means that these things are good for us, which means that the typical orientation towards them, which is to think of disagreement as a problem, as something to be overcome, or something that we just have to grapple with and live with, but it's a huge problem that we're just never going to get rid of, right? To think of it negatively, right? I think that's a mistake, and I think it leads us to other kinds of mistakes. Rather, if we see disagreement as something that on balance is positive, we'll be able to figure out how to appreciate it more. So there's kind of positive feedback loop there, and how I think to do it well, do it better. Changing this mindset isn't a panacea. We're not going to solve, get rid of war. We're not going to, get to some kind of utopia. But I do think our lives will be better if we have a better attitude towards this thing that is a part of our lives, for better or worse. And I think I'll just stop there as kind of intro remarks. I'm happy to say more about any of that, but I'll leave it to Peter to prompt me or the rest of you.
Sure. So if you have any questions for Justin, just throw them in the chats. I could be wrong, but I would say most people would agree with that. Like, yeah, disagreement's good. I think it's healthy to have good disagreement, but it's just lip service a lot of the times, and they don't do it well. So would you agree with that statement? And the other question I have is how to disagree well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I'm coming out of academic philosophy, and if you look at the course descriptions for, say, a moral problems class, you'll read the course description and you'll see something like, you'll learn how to reason well about these issues over which we disagree so that we can come to some kind of better agreement about them, right? So make some kind of progress. Or if you look at what's going on in political philosophy, a lot of political philosophy is dedicated to figuring out how people who disagree can somehow come to some kind of agreement. Like, disagreement is thought of as this, we're not perpetual problem. We're never going to get rid of it. So we have to do the second best thing of accommodating it, right? And then when it comes to, outside the realm of philosophy, like us in our everyday lives, I do think that the perception of what's going on online, for example, all this disagreements happening online, it's generally thought of in a negative way. I think when we step back and intellectually, we have in our history certain arguments, say from John Stuart Mill and others, that argument is positive. I think culturally there is a negative balance towards it, something to be avoided, something to be resolved, something to get over, something that at best is just some instrument to some point in time where we're not doing this anymore, where this is the disagreement. So I think maybe you like to you're a former philosopher, you're doing this thing where you're disagreeing and talking to people all the time. So of course there are going to be exceptions to the general sense of things, and I could be wrong, but I think the general sense of things is that it's fairly negative.
There's a huge confirmation bias I have, so that is true. So how to disagree well?
Okay, so that's a huge question, and this is something that you yourself have worked on a bit and have some interesting suggestions for. I think it's important to understand that any kind of cultural change is going to be taking a long time. Usually we can't expect to institute some rule or some policy and suddenly to have longstanding forms of human interaction change. It starts, this thing happens slowly over time. And one of the ways in which it starts slowly is by talking about values explicitly and then changing what people care about slowly over time. It's maybe even educating people starting from very young in different ways so as to come to recognize different things of value. So I think that it's important to recognize the benefits of disagreement and be very clear about them. Making the benefits of disagreement clear to everyone is one way of making it more attractive, and one way of getting people to see it as something they might want to do well. So there's kind of steps along the process. So how is disagreement good for us, right? So there are classic arguments, as I mentioned before, from John Stuart Mill about, okay, people disagree and they learn from that disagreement. There are epistemic benefits like that. Of course, disagreement makes the world a more interesting place too, right? People with different ideas coming into conflict with one another. The conflict itself can be interesting. And of course, the products of that kind of conflict can be interesting. And lots of cultural products are the result of conflict that's hidden somewhere in their history. In doing some research on this, I learned that tango, for example, the dance form, has its origin in a kind of marching, sort of physical conflict where the people who were slaves in Brazil at a certain time were mocking the slave owners with a certain kind of movement in parades, and that became the basis for tango. So, so even cultural goods can be surprisingly have their origin in conflict. I have this idea of what I call rival benefit, which is the ways in which people who disagree with one another benefit from each other in virtue of their disagreement. There are lots of examples of this. I think I talk about some in the art world, but sports fandom is a key example of this. It's much more fun to go to a game and root for your team when the opposing team's fans are there and also rooting for theirs. You're getting something out of that rivalry there. That's kind of pleasure. That's of course, that's just kind of a fun type example, but I think there are many examples of rival benefit. And if we come to explicate these, share them, talk about them, point them out, become familiar with them, we might come to see those with whom we typically disagree as not this enemy necessarily, but as a much more complicated person with whom we're in a relationship, right? There's some things in which we oppose one another, but we also benefit each other in some ways, right? Of course, not all disagreements have that characteristic, but some do. And so these are, I can talk for a really long time. I'm going to stop. So that's exciting just to hear me talk, I think, than to have a conversation. But I do think that the first steps in coming to a place where we disagree better is coming to recognize why we might want to keep disagreeing. And we have to see why it's good.
The question that's coming up now, it's related to what I mentioned at the opening. So I'm planning to launch a Platonic fight club here at the Stoa, so we get to practice disagreeing together. It's sort of like a container. And I think it would be really good to have a course. I was thinking about this for a while, having a course on reasoning, where we discuss kind of like Dave Chalmers' distinction between verbal disputes versus like factual disputes and his method elimination. And I'm curious how much of the nuts and bolts would need to be in that. Like, do I talk about deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, validity, premises, conclusions, all that type of stuff, fallacies? Because I find a lot of people, especially at the store, really intelligent, and they might not know, this is kind of like the analysis of how to make of the argument structure, but they argue anyways, and they reason well. So I'm curious, how much do you think that is needed in order to disagree well, kind of an understanding of the nuts and bolts of reasoning?
It depends on who we're trying to improve and what their current level is, right? What do we need to make someone a better disagreeer, right? I do think that having formal tools and understanding of how arguments work, what counts as a valid argument, how pieces of information might not fit together the way they would seem, and so we come up with mistakes in arguments. I do often, though, see some formal knowledge wielded in kind of dismissive and unhelpful ways, right? You give people a few tools about logic, give them a few fallacies that they can now identify, and then they're just off to the races, getting at the formal features of arguments in a way that, of course, we want to pay attention to that, but can sometimes miss the forest for the trees. right? If we look at people's dissatisfaction with public discussion nowadays, I don't think like the top of the list is, people keep committing, they're affirming the antecedent, or I don't think fallacies are really the main concern. They're probably on the list, right? People are reasoning badly about each other's views. But I think people feel generally, first of all, misunderstood or partially understood, right? It's not clear that those who are disagreeing with them really understand the view that they have. And so I think mutual misunderstanding is a worry, and that if we got better at understanding what other people were up to and what they cared about, that's one thing. Another thing, understanding why, if you're disagreeing over something controversial, it's controversial. Understanding why it's controversial. Like this is that a discussion is controversial is often part of the controversy around it. And if you're discussing this with someone who has a differing view to you, and you get the sense that they just don't understand what makes this such a big deal, then you're not going to get a lot out of you might not feel like that argument is worthwhile. You might not feel like your opponent's even able to argue in good faith. Right? So I would focus when in addition to logical nuts and bolts, which I think are important, I would focus on trying to get into the shoes of other people, right? The perspective, recognizing that when we interact with people in certain formats, like an online format, we're seeing a sliver of the whole person, and understanding that just as we ourselves are not this sliver that we put online, or the sliver that is our view on this particular topic, right? There's more to us than that. So getting people to somehow recognize that aspect of what our debates, it's not the whole person. There's a whole person back there with this view that matters. I think those elements are really crucial as well and are often overlooked.
Yeah, what came to mind, to circle back to the first part that you said, I think it was Robert Talese and Scott Aiken, they call it weaponized meta language, how they take like the tools of argumentation and people abuse it and weaponize it. I think Ben Burgess calls it like the logic bros, where like just like throwing fallacies at each other. And then the second part of what you said, like what comes to mind is like intellectual humility, applying to things like principle of charity. Is there any kind of heuristics or principles you can tease out in order to come to understanding, or in order to come to with that disposition of understanding?
Yeah, well, I think it's really challenging, and I'm not sure that there are a lot of good shortcuts. Right? I don't want to say that people shouldn't be allowed to just have some kind of bullshit session about whatever topics they want. Of course, it's a free country. People can talk about whatever they want. But if you're going to be engaging in a relatively public discussion over something, over some topic, it pays to have done your homework to some extent on it, right? Having done your homework, being aware of the relevant details, relevant facts, especially those that not just inform your view, but that inform your opponent's view, I think are crucial to debating, to disagreeing well. And so it's not a heuristic, right? It's not like a rule of thumb. It's the hard work of sometimes having done your homework. And then if not having done your homework, you sometimes have to defer to those who seem to be in a better epistemic position, because maybe this is what they're a specialist in, or maybe this is about experiences that they've undergone that you haven't, right? So I think being aware of what you don't know and being sensitive to that is a crucial part of disagreeing well. So when it comes to like a handy set of like shortcuts, I guess there's always this one. If you're really happy about how the argument is going, that should be a danger sign to you, I think. Like if you think you're doing really well, right? And this is a disagreement over a longstanding, seemingly intractable issue, and it looks like you're just completely killing it here. That suggests that you're not doing something right, probably, right? And so that should just be, maybe you're not making any mistakes. Maybe you're just doing a wonderful job. Maybe your interlocutor has certain kinds of failings. But I do think that that's sometimes a good warning light to be on guard for.
Right. So I'll pivot to the chats in a moment. Just one last question. Do you think deep disagreements, what Robert Fogelin called deep disagreements, how certain disagreements that cannot be resolved through argumentation, do you think that's a thing? And if so, how to respond to them?
I think most arguments and disagreements. I don't think that we should have hope that most of our disagreements are going to be resolved. So I certainly think that they're not going to be. We're never going to run out. Okay, so I don't want to be seen as advancing this skeptical view that we'll never make progress on certain kinds of questions over which we disagree. We certainly may, but what we end up finding out when we come to some kind of agreement on some previously contentious issue is that the issue is much more complicated than we thought, and this détente that gives us, at which we agree, just gives us a sense, a pause by which we can then recognize all the future questions that we have to deal with. I mean, in a way, this is how philosophy makes progress, right? Philosophy, in a way, never runs out of questions. What we end up finding out is, even if we can answer some question in some way, doing so opens up a whole bunch of other questions. And so philosophy progresses by increasing the body of knowledge we have about all the reasonable questions there are to ask about the things we don't know. And I feel like disagreement in a way is going to be like that. We may end up resolving for a little while, but there's a lot we don't know. There's always going to be things, further questions for us to disagree over. And furthermore, I think we're the kinds of beings who, for various reasons, like to engage in disagreement of various kinds, some forms of conflict. And unless we change our nature, which we may end up doing with technology or something like that, we're going to have disagreement for a while.
All right, very cool. Tim, you are up. If you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Can Tim unmute himself?
All right.
There you go.
I guess that's me.
Yep.
All right, hold on. Let me scroll to my question. All right. Are you familiar with Stanovich's work on cognitive decoupling, or the ability to block out context and experiential knowledge? John Nurst wrote an interesting piece on the Sam Harris-Ezra Klein debate, where he broke down his ideas on why their discussion went so badly. It had a lot to do with their respective approaches to the actual process of debating. And it seems like there needs to be a shared vision regarding how to go about having complicated discussions. And this isn't usually practical. No one will allow the other person to set the rules of engagement. Yet it seems clear that those rules are imperative.
So that's an important observation. I'm not all that familiar. I'm familiar with this term decoupling, and I have a sense of what it refers to. And I agree with your point that the parties to a disagreement are unlikely to, each is not likely to allow the other to set the terms of the debate, especially if they think that the terms might advantage one position over another in a way that's unfavorable to them. And I actually don't think that that's a mistake, because the sense in which we can distinguish between the substantive matter that we're debating over and the formal features, like we're just going to talk about this one thing, okay, right? Like that's a move in the debate that has substantive implications for how the rest of the disagreement will go. So I'm less convinced that we can easily distinguish between setting the terms of a debate in some neutral way and making substantive moves, right? There's going to be reasons to suspect that taking certain things off the table, isolating certain variables, right, is going to have substantive implications for how a disagreement goes. But I guess maybe if we can try to be honest about what those are, that could be some progress. But I don't think we should pretend towards neutrality.
Yeah, I think in what they actually were debating about isn't really super important, but that concept of how one person might have a very science-minded sort of take a hypothesis and stick and try to maintain a narrow path to isolate it from all the other dependent variables that could exist. Just, as straight as an arrow, let's try to figure this out without talking about a bunch of other things. And other people have a very rich context-oriented approach towards discussing things, and they don't like to try to really narrow down to one specific aspect. And it seems very difficult because to have a discussion between those two different types of people, which I think are both very common types of people, because those are your life experience shapes how you're going to have that type of discussion. And it was fascinating. I listened to the Harris-Klein debate, and it was kind of a train wreck. And I didn't understand why until John Nurst kind of talked about those specific ways of looking at how to even go about having the debate. So it was pretty fascinating to me, and just made me think, before I engage with someone else, I need to think, how is it that they're engaging? Like, what is their style of engagement? And what can I do to not clash with that style of engagement, even if it's not the way that I would like to do it? And that's not an easy thing to do, I don't think.
And we might learn from disagreements that derail, that go badly, right? So if there comes a point where you and your interlocutor thought that you were focusing on this one specific claim, and you've pushed it to a certain level of debate, and then your interlocutor can't proceed without bringing in these other things, what are we learning, right? One conclusion is my partner is a low decoupler. They stink at arguing, right? I think that's not probably the best conclusion to draw. Maybe it's true, but that shouldn't probably be your first bet. Your first bet might be, well, maybe there's these elements are much more closely related than I initially thought, and maybe we should explore that. So ways in which disagreements might go badly from one point of view might be seen as opportunities to learn about the issue, because I guess not all fails are things we can't learn, or epistemic fails.
Great, thanks.
Great. Key, you're up.
You may have answered this question in the last bit of what you said. Not all fails are epistemic fails, but I'll ask the question anyways, because I just didn't do my homework before coming to the session. So can you please describe what epistemic defeat means to you? I noticed that you published a post about a research fellow who wrote about agency, rationality, and epistemic defeat. Would love to hear your views on this and how to talk about it with the forms of conflict that add to understanding. Thanks.
I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you, Key, because so it's true that I posted about some person who won a very large grant for work on epistemic defeat, but that was that person's research project. It's not my research project. So one of the things I do at Daily News is just post news about what's happening in philosophy. And when someone gets $1 million grant to do some philosophy, that's news. So that's what happened. So I don't have a particular, I think, particularly interesting conception of epistemic defeat. But to go back to that point about not all fails are epistemic fails, I was just mainly saying that, look, the disagreement might come to an end, right? Someone might get angry even, right? or the topic might get derailed in a way that leaves the audience confused. And so the discussion fails to proceed. However, right, we can learn, just as, you know, when there's a car accident, I guess not a car accident, but you know, they're testing, and the engineers are testing products, for example, and the product fails, right? Or programmers are, you know, testing code and the program fails. But these are opportunities for learning. And I think the same thing is true when disagreements go badly. Disagreements may proceed in ways we don't like. Other people might proceed in ways we don't like. Maybe you're more of a moderate person and you have someone who's technically on your side, but they're just radically pushing super hard in ways that you find objectionable, right? You know, so there all sorts of stuff might not proceed as you would like, and people might not behave as you would like, but nonetheless, right, these are opportunities, you know, to assess what we can learn from them not going our way, including about ourselves. Of what don't I know, such that all these people are happy for it to go this way and I'm not, right? If I don't understand why they're happy, then that's something I should learn about, even if I don't end up agreeing that I ought to be happy about it. So I didn't really answer your question, Key, sorry, but at least there's some ruminations that are in the vicinity.
Indeed. Thanks, Justin.
Nicole, you're up.
Hi. So my question is just a difficulty that I have experienced whenever I venture into a conversation with somebody who like watches the news, for example, quite consistently. So my question is, it's difficult to disagree with someone whose identity is structured around their opinions, whether they're political or religious, etc. And yet, I think a lot of people do have their identity structured around their opinions. Do you have any advice or any suggestions for how does one navigate these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, so that's a good observation, and it's a difficult question. And I think it leads to a topic which I think should be part of any discussion about how disagreement is going to proceed, which is about the contexts in which disagreement happens. Now, right now, so much of our disagreement happens online, right? In forums where, you know, we're sending small snippets of text back and forth to one another. And I think that is a situation that doesn't lend itself to the most understanding. And as I said earlier, like when we're talking about like what are the kinds of things that we want people who are learning about disagreement to learn, apart from say fallacies and reasoning, right? Being able to understand that there's a whole person with whom you're disagreeing, I think is an important part of that. And when we have like Twitter fights and stuff like that going on, we're just not getting that whole person. But if you have the opportunity, like we don't right now because of COVID, but you probably have the opportunity to have a conversation with someone in person with whom you disagree in a friendly environment, maybe over a drink or something like that. I think that even when the person's personality is wrapped up in a certain ideology, right? They're just all about this thing, that you can still try to put yourself in their shoes and still try to couch various points you might have in ways that that they might recognize as acknowledging from their point of view what's important. I would say let's step back a little bit, and maybe we need to educate people not to develop their personalities around their ideas as much. And this is something that I try to impart to my philosophy students, my undergraduates, that in a class where we deal with lots of controversial issues, they might come in the door with their opinions about things, but it's much less important that they be the one, much less important that they're the ones who came in with the right answer than they're the ones who leave with a sense that they have a better justified answer. right? And that's the difference between debate and philosophy, and one, or at least one of the differences between debate and philosophy, right? With debate, the point is to be the one who came into the room with the right answer, right? With philosophy, it's to come out of the room with a better answer, and or at least a better set of questions, right? And so I try to tell my students, you know, if you have a commitment, let it be a commitment to what's true, and don't wrap your personality around an ideology. You'll go through life worried that your some evidence is going to overturn your ideology, and it'll turn you into a jerk. It'll be hard to talk to. So I totally get the problem that you're dealing with, like the people who've wrapped their personality around an ideology, and they're not my favorite people to talk to, but I should probably take some of my own advice to acknowledge that they probably have something valuable to contribute, and that we should try to engage in contexts that allow us to try to see more of their whole person and let them see more of our whole person, and not just the presentations of our ideology, which is what happens in online contexts. Sorry, that was a bit rambly, but hopefully it was somewhat helpful.
Thank you.
Sure.
We love rambly here at the Stoa, just for the record.
Okay.
Evan, you're up.
Hey, so I really like what you're saying about disagreement and its role as part of a healthy way of interacting. And I guess the thing that I'm struggling with here is, you know, the bullshit in the Frankfurt sense, right? Communication who's not really intended to be true. Truth isn't the point of it. It seems like the public square is, to some degree, poisoned or infected by bullshit. And a lot of the examples of debate that we see between public intellectuals are highly full of bullshit. And that doesn't seem, at least to me, to be a super healthy way of conducting disagreement. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on this phenomenon, and if you have any suggestions for how to engage in disagreement in a way that's less prone to weaponized bullshit being slung.
Okay, so yeah, bullshit is a really interesting subject, and like, yeah, so bullshit has a very negative connotation, obviously, and in part, I think justly deserved, right? So bullshit, in the sense that Evan is referring to, is speech that's made not because it's true, right? Not in regard to the truth at all, but really just to give the listener a certain kind of impression of the speaker, or to get the listener to do or believe something, you know, but it's really not oriented towards the truth or concerned with the truth. It's said with disregard to the truth. So what should we think about bullshit? Is bullshit the kind of thing that is antithetical to good disagreement? I think the true answer is sometimes, all right? And I'm sure we can come up with lots of examples in which people's bullshit has made a debate or disagreement or discussion go badly. I teach bullshit in one of my undergrad classes, and I use as one of the key examples, it's an old example now, so I probably have to update it, but back when Obama was president, Senator John Kyle got up on the floor of the Senate and was complaining about the funding of Planned Parenthood, and he says Planned Parenthood, 90% of what they fund is abortions, right? And you know, Stephen Colbert made this the focus of one of his segments, and Colbert says, well, that's just unbelievable, in the sense that it's not true. The true number is like 3% of Planned Parenthood's funding goes towards abortion, and as Colbert puts it, Kyle just rounded up to the nearest 90. But what was remarkable about this story is that when he was called on it, what Kyle said, Kyle released a press release that said that was not intended as a factual statement. So basically what he said was, I was bullshitting, right? So now we are at the point, right, where a member of the United States legislature is not only bullshitting, but telling us that he's bullshitting, and doing so because he knows that it doesn't matter, right? So that's where that does seem highly problematic. So I totally get it. On the other hand, if there's something the last 4 years have taught me, is the importance of bullshit. Because look, like any other person, you know, we know that politicians are full of it, right? Even the politicians we like can be full of it, all right? And so I used to be very cynical, I still am cynical, about politicians and when they speak and what they say. And then what we got for the last 4 years is a failure of, a lack of bullshit, basically is what we have, right? We've gotten people to not even give lip service to decorum, to not even give lip service to rule of law, to not even give lip service to equality and fairness, and our sense of public spiritedness. And as, I mean, I guess comics are my lodestar here, but Aziz Ansari said early on in the Trump administration that he was worried about the racists who were in support of Trump. And he's like, I know there's always going to be racism, but the problem is it's out in the open, and you need to go back to pretending you weren't racist. We didn't know how important it was for you to pretend you weren't racist, but thank you for your service, he says. Please go back to pretending. And the reason is that some forms of bullshit are good, right? In a way that it's a kind of cultural fake it till you make it kind of thing. And so we have to sometimes be politer than we really think is warranted, so that we get to cultural norms which make it the case that people come to adopt values that match up to what we were previously faking, right? So I think bullshit's a mixed bag, really. Furthermore, right, the kinds of bullshit that are involved in disagreements where there's sometimes civility, or the pretense of civility is bullshit. People sometimes will fake the norms of civility rather than really feel them, but that could be useful too, right? In a discussion. So I don't have a recipe for getting rid of bullshit, but I think the picture of bullshit is complicated. Sometimes good, useful, helpful, even for disagreement, certainly for other things, and sometimes awful in just the way you recognize.
Quick follow-up, any ideas on how to encourage pro-social rather than anti-social bullshit? Like in one's own personal interactions or just on society scale, wherever you want to take that?
Yeah, so I think if you carry yourself as the kind of person who doesn't mind being wrong, okay? Like if you can make this known to others, then one of the drivers for bullshit, which is this need to defeat or win over, whoever it is you're talking with, I think goes away, right? Because if it's no big deal, right? I mean, it's in a way it's modeling a kind of epistemic humility, kind of modeling an aim at the truth that can, I think, undercut to some extent the motivation for someone to bullshit with you. So I mean, I think we need some studies really to show which, this is just my sense of things. I'm constantly out there in front of a bunch of philosophers saying things that I know will probably be mistaken, and I admit it. And so I've tried to cultivate a public personality for being okay with being wrong. Hopefully not too wrong all the time, but and I think it helps when I'm engaging with people one-on-one, and it helps when I'm dealing with controversial subjects that people feel like they can trust me to try to at least understand what they're up to.
All right. Steph, you had a question.
So, I mean, this is related to the question of bullshit. I feel like online, like we have this problem that, in a place like Twitter, there's no instinct and no push towards us finding common ground like we're drawn to when we're talking face to face. I'm wondering, like, if you've got any thoughts on, if places like Twitter were built from the ground up, what different kinds of ways they might be able to be built that would bring those best parts of us into those discourse spaces.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And one of the things that I was wondering about just prior to this discussion was, is the problem that we're kind of in this halfway spot technologically, where there's part of us that's online, right? And it's this partialness which lends itself to the acrimonious bitterness, this like sense of futility sometimes of disagreement that's happening online in a way that is very different from when a bunch of people get together and have a discussion in person, right? So maybe the solution is we need to move more of ourselves online, maybe, but I don't even know what that would be. I'm not a techno-futurist or something like that, so I don't have a grand vision for what that would look like, where if we're more robustly online, right? I don't want to take the Luddite solution and say, well, we just shouldn't do this, right? Because that's as far as making disagreement go better in a context like Twitter, I don't know. I mean, part of me thinks forced timeouts would be a great idea, you know?
I mean, or maybe let me reframe, like, what are the spaces online? I mean, this is in my mind one of them, but like, what are the spaces online, leaving Twitter aside, where you feel like this kind of discourse is done the best?
Okay, so it's tough, right? So this is something that I struggle with. So I run this website, Daily News. It's mainly for just academic philosophers. So the people who comment on my blog are philosophy professors, philosophy grad students, and some other people who have to be interested. And so you'd think, okay, these people are training to be basically professional disagreeers. They're going to be great at it, and I will say, like, they're better than average, but still, I think if it's my site, so I'm going to have I'll probably have a better opinion of it than others. But my critics, like people who don't like my site, will say that the comments are bad. Comments are terrible, and sometimes I agree. But like, it's so even with people who are well trained, but okay, nonetheless, I've tried, and I could try harder in different ways, but I've tried to set out a mentality for commenters, and this is how I initially did it. Right? So rather than set out some a whole list of rules, I said this: imagine that you are in a room with people you like, and you're seated at in a comfortable chair at a beautiful table with a beautiful view, with your favorite drink in front of you, and you've come there to discuss controversial issues with people you like, along with a kid who you're teaching about how to talk about. This is how you're with a kid who you want to model good behavior for, right? So you're comfortable, your shoes are off, whatever, just put yourself in this mindset. Because I just wanted people to relax and just chill out and enjoy a conversation. And I think that helped for like a month or 2 or 6 months. I don't know, but this blog's been around for 6 years now, and I think it's worn off to some extent. I have to come up with some new trick, right, to get people in there. But one of the things that's been nice about COVID, of course, is being able to interact with a whole new range of strangers in a format where you can see their faces. It's much harder to be snarky in a context like this, right? It's much harder to get like one line off and think that you've triumphed in some way, right? And everyone's not really like, what a jerk, So maybe like more technology, right? Along these lines, more interactive technology is the way to go, where we can, again, see more of the person and not insulate ourselves from each other.
Thanks. That's interesting.
All right. Maybe we can sneak in 1 or 2 more questions. Elf, you had a question, I believe. Yep, Elf.
Hi, Justin. My question is around when we're trying to disagree well, like 2 things I've come across are having good faith. If you don't have that, that's obviously a poison pill. So that's a big problem now, how to overcome that one. And then 2, like a disparity in developmental psychology levels, depending on whatever model you want to use, but the morals, EQ, the cognitive complexity, and like how does someone that's metasystemic try to deal with someone that's trying to draw that linear line in the sand? So how can we disagree well, especially if most disagreements can't even be resolved?
Right, so I do think that it's the success of a disagreement is not its resolution, right? It's not coming to agreement. And I guess that's why I started with the comments that I did. I mean, look, for practical purposes, sometimes we need to get on the same page to do something. Like we need to figure out which restaurant we're going to for dinner. So, okay, yeah, so sometimes we do need to agree. But like, so I shouldn't be too grandiose in my proclamations about the point of, disagreement. Sometimes we do need to agree. But so that said, like, so the question, if I understand your question correctly, you're dealing with someone who's just their way of being in the world is very different from your own. Like their goals for the conversation are different. Their capacity for engaging in it is different. So okay, so yeah, I'm not sure I have any like well-formed thoughts about that, except it does put me in the mind of sometimes when you're a teacher, you have very different students. I teach at a state school. There's a huge range of students there with different capacities, different orientations, different backgrounds, different commitments, different levels of interest in the ideas. And I have to somehow engage successfully with them. And what I find is that can often be a learning experience for me. I mean, I know how to deal with certain kinds of people, and I know how to deal with lots of different kinds of people at this point in my life, but along the way, and even to this day, I'm still encountering people who I just don't understand how they're in college, for example, or I don't understand how they, and not necessarily because of a lack of skill, but like, how did they make it given all the other stuff that was going on in their life, you know? Like, sometimes that's the explanation, you know? So, I think that, you know, you want to get out of disagreement what you can, and maybe it's not going to be convincing someone else to your side. Maybe it's not going to even be learning something substantively new, but maybe what it'll be is learning how to present ideas that you care about to someone who's just so alien to you. And how would you go about doing that? And it's just practice at that. I think that's, you got to see what the value you can take out of these kinds of interactions. But if it's completely, I mean, if you can't find that, then I would just say, don't, you know, just say, I'm going to take today off.
I think you're right, Justin. It's practice. I was hoping you had some insight porn for me, but I think you really got to know your shit to break it down, simplicity to communicate it, and then also to meet them where they're at. Like, it's this extra step. So it's just extreme skill. But yeah, thank you.
I really like the phrase insight porn, by the way. So Christian has a question. I'm going to read it on his behalf. As a modern analog to the trickster who breaks up norms to prevent calcification and makes space for innovation, does the troll have a healthy function in a society where people can get completely absorbed in their reality tunnels and conditioned ideas, feelings, behaviors? And could there be a way to make trolling more efficacious in this regard rather than being done in a mean-spirited way, quote unquote, sacred troll?
So I guess my answer is it's yes. That's reluctantly in a way, because as someone who moderates a forum, I have to deal with trolls, and they're not like great to deal with. But one of the things that I've had to recognize is that there are benefits to different forms of conversational participation. They play different roles, and sometimes it's valuable to have those roles. You have to, in a way, kind of do a cost-benefit analysis. Some forms of trolling are just more destructive and annoying than, you know, given the aims of the particular forum or the aims of the conversation that you're engaged in. So I will say yes to the big question, can trolls be useful? Yes. What does that tell us about any specific troll in any particular context? Not a whole lot. We need to sort of weigh the benefits and burdens there, but do so in an open-minded way, I think, to recognize that the trolling might be valuable, and just, you know, keep it open as a possibility, even if you ultimately decide that it's not. As for productive forms of trolling, I think we already have that in existence. It just doesn't appear to us. We might not call it trolling because it steps up. You know, it's the kind of person who, you know, a bunch of people are agreeing about whatever some view, and this person has access to some article that has some empirical information that completely undercuts their position, and he's like, haha, boom, right? And that's, in a way, he's doing it to troll, but he's also doing it in a way that actually is substantively informative. And so, lo and behold, we have some helpful trolling there. You know, some of it might come down to the moderators to encourage the trolls to be more helpful in that regard.
Was Socrates a troll?
No, I don't think so. You know, part of the problem. Well, so most of the time, where Socrates is interacting with people who wanted to hang out with him, right? Not always, right? Sometimes he would stop someone on the street and they're trying to scuttle away, but most of the time he was talking to people who wanted to hang out with him, and that's one difference between the troll and Socrates, right? Usually the troll is not wanted. So.
All right. So we're approaching the end of the hour. I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of any concluding thoughts. I know questions were hitting from you from all corners, which is what the Stoa is about. But yeah, any kind of summarizing thoughts?
Well, I think that, you know, for me, there's a lot for me to learn still about this, right? So one of the things we didn't get to talk about today was some of the writing that Peter himself has done on specific ways we might improve conversational context. And he in fact has done a lot of detailed work on the nature of various different kinds of groups. So I'm kind of sorry that we didn't get to talk more about your taxonomies and your strategies there. So maybe hopefully, since this is your forum, you get to do that at other times. I will say, like, if I'm just trying to get, you know, one thing across, it would, well, it's not gonna be just one thing, but one of the things I try to teach my students is just how much more complicated all the issues that they care about are, how much more complicated they are than they're presented by the media, by politicians, by the authorities in their lives, right? It's one of the great joys of philosophy to leave students with more questions at the end of the class about a subject than they came in with, right? So they can just see how complicated things are. And I think recognition of complication is one kind of ingredient for better disagreement, right? For more honest disagreement, for a kind of epistemic modesty that might just cause us to be less oriented towards winning and more oriented towards understanding. But that said, sometimes, you know, when people are oriented towards winning and they push really hard and it's annoying, it still can be something we learn from. So I think the other point is just, there's a lot of behavior we don't like online, lots of people we don't like interacting with, ways in which disagreements go badly, and to the best of our ability, we should try to see what we can learn from those people and those experiences too.
Right. Yeah, that's what kind of the Stoa is in service towards, is building a good relationship with, like, unknowingness in general, and then holding this complexity while not collapsing to one sort of mimetic tribe or reality tunnel or whatever. So that being said, I'll make some closing announcements, but Justin, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa today. It was a treat.
My pleasure. It's just a really nice conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, we have a bunch of events. What's the next one I'm going to talk about? So at the website, yeah, we have something called the Reflective Structured Dialogue with Jill DeTemple. Justin, you might like interest. Are you familiar with structured? How do you pronounce that? Reflective Structured Dialogue.
I think I've heard of it, but I don't have any content to go along with my having heard of it. So.
Yeah, I don't know much about it either, but apparently it's a cool conversational modality catered towards disagreements, and then it's kind of like a bunch of academics are using it. So that's October 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern time. You can check that out. It's part of the Communitas Club thing that we're having here. And yeah, so let's have a post-sense-making session. We'll turn off the recording. This is optional for you to stay, Justin. You can leave at this point, and then we'll just jam for a little bit. So that being said, Justin, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa.
Good talking with you all. Have a good night.